Touching the Essence. 6 Lectures on Buddhism. By Bhikkhu Dhammapala. Henry van Zeyst. Dependent origination. 5 causes were there in the past. And now a 5-fold fruit. 5 causes in this present life. A 5-fold fruit to come. When speaking of origination, one can approach the subject from 2 different viewpoints. One is the view of those who believe in a supernatural cause and thus maintain an ultimate beginning or creation. To them the Buddha repeatedly declared that an absolute first beginning of existence is something unthinkable, and that all such like speculations may lead to imbecility, and 4:77. We shall revert to this view after having explained the Buddha's doctrine of origination. His doctrine is not fruitless speculation, but is based on actuality. Hence it will be understood best, when as starting point is taken not some imaginary time in the untraceable past, called in the beginning, but an actual fact of the present, which is open to investigation and experiment. The fact of suffering and the fact that all is suffering, because all is impermanent, is indeed the actual basis from which one can start the reconstruction pointing towards origination. It is also the basis from which the work of deliverance can be started. Unless the fact of suffering is understood as universal, as explained on a previous occasion, it is impossible to find out its origin, impossible to find deliverance therefrom. Here is no revelation needed, and hence the supernatural signifies nothing. Here mere argument avails nothing, for mere words cannot solve an actual problem. And thus we start not with the beginning, but with the actual, experimental fact that life is sorrow-fraught. Now it is clear that this sorrow and disappointment, due to the impermanence of all things, is only possible where there is conscious life to perceive the same. Thus we have the well-known formula, Jati Pakaya Jara Maranam. Dependent on birth is old age, death, and all kinds of woe. As death should be understood in the sense of dissolution in the physical as well as in the psychical sense, so birth should be understood in the sense of conception, physical and mental. Thus rebirth and death do not occur only once at the beginning and the end of a lifetime respectively, but at every new thought moment, so that the saying, quotidi morior, I die daily, 1 Cor 15.31, receives an unexpectedly new meaning in the Buddhist sense. It is the wrong view of seeing death only at the end of a lifetime which produces that misconception of a self, transmigrating from life to life. Death is not caused by birth, neither is sorrow, but both are dependent in their arising on the fact of birth. Thus birth is the conditio sine qua non, the upanacea pakaya, the condition of sufficing efficiency. It is the natural disposition, pakatupanacea, of any birth to give rise to sorrow, not the cause thereof, but the necessary circumstance under which that relation obtains, an indispensable, antecedent phenomenon. The characteristics of decline, jarata, and impermanence, anakkata, are natural to all matter. They are not produced by any principle at all, i.e. not by kama, mind, season, or nutriment, lakhanani naj anti-kahisiti pakasitam. Where suffering is dependent on birth by which it is conditioned, birth itself is caused by kama. Dependent on the kama process of becoming is rebirth, bhavapakaya jati. It is the active kama process that produces the passive rebirth process, upadibhava. Where the reaction has to work out, where the result, vipaka, has to be outlived. It is the will to live that makes one live again. It is this lust for life that conditions the kind of life to come. No other doctrine can explain the differences that appear, though outward conditions may be absolutely the same. This process of becoming is volition transmuted into action with skillful or unskillful consequences. As soon as the opportunity is favorable, it will reproduce itself, express itself, according to the nature of the means of expression at its disposal. Thus it is that the process of kama is the process of becoming and the cause of rebirth. The differences which can be observed even where external conditions of parents, blood and food are equal as in the case of twins, cannot be without a cause, cannot be mechanical products, for they do not always happen to all. As in the subjective continuity of those beings no other reason can be found, the process of becoming must be due to kama. It is true that there are many who wish to give this doubtful honor to some supernatural intervention. But this explanation, instead of solving the problem inside the process, induces a mysterious factor from outside, thus making the problem even more complicated and unsolvable indeed. It is no good trying to explain a mystery by one still more intricate. Moreover, he who claims the honor for the good, ought to take also the blame for the evil. It is the karma process that leads to rebirth, as a flame burns on through its inner nature in a process of combustion. And like a flame will always lay hold of fresh material so long as that is available, so karma will lay hold of new material to express its process of craving. For karma is essentially volition. Dependent on clinging, arises the karma process, upadana bhavu. From the different kinds of clinging it can be understood how subtle is its working, and how difficult it must be to escape its meshes. There is the grosser clinging to sensuous pleasures, kamupadana. Though few are able to free themselves entirely from this snare, it is not so difficult to be at least aware of the danger. All spiritual men have given their warnings, all have spoken in praise of control over the senses. But not only the body with its natural passions must be tamed. The mind which guides the activities of the other senses ought to be controlled, its wild activities and fancies checked. A forcible repression of the bodily senses only will naturally result in a reaction that might be dangerous from a mental point of view. Suppressed passionate tendencies have often led to serious hallucinations. And if that suppression is done with a supernatural motive, it always leads to fanaticism, where sometimes bloodthirsty hate is taken for love of truth. The clinging to erroneous opinions, dithupadana, is therefore much more dangerous, because where error is seen as the truth, all further consequences will be seen in the wrong light, even though their deduction be correct, like a sum cannot be worked out properly. Even if the method be correct, if there was an initial mistake in the thesis. One of the most common erroneous opinions is the one that sees motion everywhere and nothing moved without a cause. And yet maintains that there can be a mover who moves all but not himself. The clinging to mere ritual, silabhatupadana, is the superstition, when e.g. through outward washing inner purity is sought. Similar actions can be classed as spiritual bribery and only betray a lack of moral courage and sense of responsibility. It is not only an overvaluation of means to a certain end, but reliance upon inappropriate actions which are, therefore, not means at all. The clinging to the belief in a self, attavatupadana, is the most subtle of all and hence the most difficult to overcome. It is this fetter of self-illusion, Sakyaditthi, in all its 20 modes, which prevents one even from entering the path to holiness, Sotapanna. It is this root of selfishness which underlies all growth of karma and of rebirth. It is the heat of the fire that keeps the water boiling and makes ever new steam develop. But this clinging could not arise if there were not craving first. Through craving is conditioned clinging, tanha pakayupadanam. It is craving for sense pleasures, kamatanha, that leads to sensuous clinging. It is craving for eternal existence, bhavatanha, which gives rise to clinging to the belief in a self, attavatupadana. It is craving for annihilation, vibhavatanha, which is the origin of clinging to erroneous opinions, dithupadana. By not realizing the necessity of effects arising from causes, the possibility of further effects will be overlooked and thus rebirth denied. Craving for annihilation might also lead one to employ inappropriate means to nullify kamic reactions by superstitious practices, silabhatupadana. Craving is the real turning point, the crank that sets the wheel of rebirth, the machinery of life and death working. Craving imparts selfishness, that is, the I concept, to mere sensation, thus fertilizing the seeds produced by previous action. Here with craving, the problem of rebirth is given anew, and with the cessation of craving this problem is solved. In the process of craving, karma is conceived which in due time will grow out into rebirth and death, like from friction the spark is born which will grow out into a conflagration. With this process of grasping is given the explanation of individuality, for life is a process of grasping. If craving is dissolved, the whole world becomes a mere play of the senses, where the self is no longer an actor. Where the self does not act there is no karma and no more rebirth. so that with the ending of craving the turning of the wheel of samsara will have come to a stop. This, however, does not explain the beginning, the origination of craving. Craving, clinging, desire, volition, will, is not a force which is stored up to be discharged at any moment. But it arises anew over and over again, and in its arising lies the meaning of this whole play of world events. For apart from this I the world has no meaning. The I is a reaction, and without this reaction how can action be known? This reaction is sensation, and on this sensation is dependent craving, Vedana pakaya tanha. Here again, sensation or feeling is not the cause of craving, but merely a condition. For without sensation no craving can arise, and yet not all sensation needs to produce craving. Here alone a break is possible. Here alone in the long chain of conditioned reactions it is possible to come to a stop. If all feeling would result in craving with all its evil consequences, the attainment of Arahantship and Nibbana would be impossible. Like a seed can grow up into a plant under favorable circumstances, and yet those circumstances, however necessary, are not the cause of the plant, but mere conditions to its growth, so sensation can develop into craving. If the conditions thereto are favorable, the favorable condition to the arising of craving is ignorance, for if knowledge of the real nature of things were present, craving would be impossible. It is thus to ignorance, avijja, that we shall have to trace the origin of craving. Feeling or sensation in any of its three modes of pleasure, pain, or indifference, in so far as it is a karma resultant, is the condition without which no craving can arise, Vedana pakaya tanha. Thus pleasurable feeling might give rise to craving for more, painful feeling to craving for freedom therefrom, and indifferent feeling to craving for its tranquil sensation. Feeling, however, cannot arise without contact, phasa. Sensation cannot arise without the senses, salayatana. Here it is clearly seen that the causal chain of dependent origination, paticca samuppada, should not be understood as a pure succession of cause and effect. It is the growth, the development, the evolution process where the successive stage is contained in germ form. As it were, in the preceding one, requiring only the proper conditions to sprout forth. Thus in the six senses of mind and body are contained the possibilities of contact and sensation. Similarly in consciousness, vijnana, are contained the other three mental groups of sensation. Perception and mental formations, vedana, sana, sankhara. Thus it is said that through consciousness are conditioned corporeality and mentality, vijnana pakaya namarupa. And that dependent on the six senses of body and mind arise contact and sensation, salayatana pakaya phaso. Consciousness and its mental concomitants, hence also sense impression or contact and feeling or sensation, are all simultaneously arising and hence related in the sense of coexistence, sahajata pakaya. As a candle which is burning, burns together with its heat and light. But they are also mutually supporting one another, anamananasaya pakaya. Like when three sticks are set upright leaning against one another at their upper ends, each of them depends on, and is depended on by, the other two. If one of them falls, all will fall at the same time. Leti sayada. Consciousness itself, however, is a product of kama formations in the past, sankhara pakaya vinanam. As the kama process in the present, kama bhava, will produce birth and its consequences, so the kama formations of the past, sankhara, have produced this present conscious life. Like the kama process in the present finds its origin in craving and clinging, so the kama of the past was formed in ignorance, avijja pakaya sankhara. Craving and ignorance are synonymous. Craving is ignorance, for in ignorance we crave for things impermanent, sorrow-fraught, and substanceless. Further back than ignorance we cannot go, for if there would have been a time when there was no ignorance, there ought to have been knowledge supreme. But to say that knowledge supreme has produced ignorance is as nonsensical as to say that perfection could produce imperfection, that goodness could produce evil. Ignorance thus stands as the sufficient reason for life, when life is seen as a process of grasping. Is ignorance then the ultimate beginning of everything? This question so frequently put is ignorance manifest. To speak of a beginning where there is no entity is a sheer impossibility. A process can have no beginning, but is beginning constantly, can have no end, but is ceasing constantly. Not to understand this is ignorance, and dependent on ignorance arise the karma formations, which through processes of conscious grasping lead to rebirth, which is sorrow-fraught. It is in ignorance that the I concept is formed. It is in craving that the I concept is maintained. Ignorance creates a delusion, and craving clings to it. And thus comes about this whole play of world events which turns round the self like a wheel round its axle. But as, when the axle is broken the wheel will not turn any more, so, when the delusion of self is destroyed. When insight has destroyed ignorance, no further craving can arise, no further karma can be formed. The wheel of samsara will no more turn, the process of becoming and rebirth will have come to a stop. Where ignorance thus gives rise to craving, the freedom from craving can only be obtained through the overcoming of ignorance and the insight into the real nature of things. Ignorance also is a kind of understanding, it is misunderstanding. It is cognition with craving and thus it leads to formation, i.e. karma. But cognition without craving, that is right understanding which does not lead to further formation of karma. This understanding is not to be obtained by mere reasoning. Through purity of virtue, through renunciation and mind control, insight will grow, insight into the real nature of things. When things are seen as void of self and impermanent, they will be understood as sorrow-fraught and the first noble truth will have been realized. When it is further seen that all our disappointment arises from our craving for things void and impermanent, then craving will become an impossibility. If there is no more craving, there will be no more karma process of becoming, resulting in rebirth. Thus while ignorance stands as the origin of all this suffering through grasping, insight alone offers the deliverance therefrom. Where a beginning as ultimate origin cannot be pointed out. Just because there are no entities but mere processes rolling on, because nothing has a beginning but is only a phase in the process of evolution, which is always beginning, yet this process can come to a stop simply by no more beginning, by no more becoming. Let past be past, no future longings house. The past is dead, the morrow not yet born. Whoso with insight scans his heart today, let him ensure eternal changelessness. Bhattacharita Sutta, MN 131. This goal cannot be attained by striving, for striving under any form keeps the process moving. But the truth has to be lived so that it may grow naturally, till the light of insight will have dispelled all shadows of ignorance. And the deliverance from all craving, which is the bliss beyond all feeling, will have surmounted all happiness and sorrow in the cessation of becoming, Nibbana. Nibbana. Sorrow is found in all three worlds. Its origin by craving wrought. Its ceasing is Nibbana called. The path thereto transcendent thought. Abhidhammathe Sangaha 509. Once more we must make the universal fact of suffering the starting point of our quest. And if this time our goal is the highest, the best, the final attainment of Nibbana, even that goal ought to be understood in the light of the truth or suffering. For Nibbana is the deliverance from all sorrow. This certainly is not a subject for speculations. As sorrow must be understood and experienced, so the deliverance therefrom must both be understood and experienced. And only he who has experienced will understand. But that understanding cannot benefit others except in the way of encouragement to follow up along the same path. So that we too may learn and discern, understand and experience each one for himself, Pakadam. Vanasankatiya tanhaya nikantata nibbananti vokati. As a departure from that kind of craving, which is lust, it is called Nibbana. Abhides 458. Even if Nibbana, objectively considered, is viewed as the absolute truth, the ultimate reality, the highest perfection, the further shore, the final goal, and bliss supreme, yet it must never be overlooked that this objectivity is entirely due to our subjective viewpoint. Even if Nibbana is often described in terms of positive happiness like peace, bliss, calm, permanence, freedom, deliverance, this is only so through the departure of all that had the nature of a fetter to rebirth and sorrow. Certainly Nibbana is the highest bliss, paramam sukham. But if this bliss be understood as a blissful experience, a happy feeling or sensation, Nibbana would be subject to impermanence and sorrow. Because all feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and concepts are impermanent and therefore sorrow-fraught. Happiness which can be experienced is, therefore, not the highest bliss, because it bears within itself the germ of dissolution. The highest bliss, therefore, must be beyond the experience of the senses. It is just because there is no sense experience that Nibbana is happiness, said the Venerable Sariputta. Thus only by holding fast to the negative aspect of Nibbana will it be possible to approach the subject intelligently. Yet that is not the real approach. This should be done not by understanding but by realizing. For the sake, however, of encouragement in the quest for truth, we have also the means of an intellectual approach which has no further meaning and importance than that of a map to a traveler in an unknown land. There, like here, all names are new and strange, but can be identified at each stage of progress till the goal is reached. From the outset we must be prepared, however, to leave behind our own mode of thinking, like the traveler his home. And though traveling on the map only and by reading books can be highly interesting and can be done in an easy chair at home, yet it cannot be compared with the actual journey, even if that would involve much fatigue and discomfort. What then shall we say about the actual attainment? But here already we have to leave alone our comparison, and at once the language becomes unfamiliar. For though there is a road, there is no traveler, Magamathi, Gamako na Vijiti. That Nibbana is beyond doubt. For where there is the thesis of a process, there must be also the antithesis of no more proceeding. Thus with the thesis of the process of life as suffering is given also the antithesis of the deliverance from suffering through the ending of the process of becoming. And with this we have the clearest definition of Nibbana, cessation of becoming, Bhavanirodho Nibbanam, S2 117. Where becoming stands for the arising of sensations and conceptions. For rebirth and its consequences of woe and death, for impermanence and sorrow, for the arising of fear and craving, for the growth of the roots of all evil, of greed, hate and delusion. For the tightening of material and spiritual bonds there the cessation of becoming will naturally be viewed as bliss supreme. But this bliss of the cessation of becoming can only be understood when becoming itself is understood as suffering. But because becoming is thought of as desirable notwithstanding birth, old age, sickness, and death are like cowherds with staves in their hands, which drive beings on, and cut life short as with an axe, DHP Commander 135. Because there are few or none that desire absence of rebirth, cessation of becoming is not understood as bliss. In the delusion of self it is seen as annihilation, and annihilation it is namely of the delusion of self. But like a man given over to the excessive use of drugs will always take more, preferring to dream on rather than to face actuality. So the world clings to the delusion of self and considers deliverance therefrom as undesirable. In the quest for truth, however, satisfaction and beauty come last. Both being entirely subjective, they arise and disappear with the idea of self. Self is the shadow made by our own action, moving along with it, inseparable. As the shadow is longest when the sun stands lowest, to become smaller while the sun rises higher, so the delusion of self is greatest when the light of insight is lowest. But with the increase of insight the delusion will decrease. It is this growth of insight that will finally lead to the deliverance from all delusion. As always in Buddhism, so here in the development of insight also, the starting point is actuality. Thus the first insight required will be insight into the real nature of conditioned things, samasananana, as having the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering and soullessness. They have to be seen as one, for who perceives sorrow but not the transience thereof has nothing but the pain without the hope of deliverance. But as soon as the unreality of life is understood, also the unreality of suffering will be seen. From this understanding of unreality, insight in the nature of all things as processes, Hidaya Bayanana, will ripen. This does not merely mean the observation that things grow and decay, but the understanding that there is nothing but a process of becoming. The understanding of the process of becoming will naturally lead to the next step, which is insight that becoming is ceasing, Bainganana. Though this step should follow quite logically, yet it is a difficult one for many who in the very fact of becoming find all their delight. But if becoming and ceasing are seen as two aspects of one process, then insight into what is to be feared, Bayanana, will arise naturally. Fear should lead to understanding of the danger, Adanavanana, inherent in clinging to mere processes of cessation. And of the reasons to be disgusted with such an empty show, Nibbana. A desire to be set free and the knowledge thereof, Munsitukamaidanana, will grow out into recontemplation, Padasangkananana. That is contemplation of the same three characteristics of transience, suffering and soullessness. But with the increased insight as seen from a higher plane. Insight of indifference to the activities of this life, Sankarapekhanana, will be a natural consequence of this disgust and deeper understanding. Where even-mindedness is due not to lack of interest, but to lack of self-interest. The climax of discernment finally is reached with the insight of adaptation, Annulomanana, which is the gateway to emancipation, Vimukhemukha, where the mind is qualified for the path of holiness. No morbid asceticism can be the way leading to emancipation, but rather the well-being of a concentrated mind without worry, without agitation, without preoccupation, without craving or clinging to either good or bad. Not even striving in the good sense can procure one this blessed state. For striving is desire, and desire can only arise for something to be attached to. How can there be attachment for what is entirely beyond sensation and mental conception? There can be no desire for Nibbana, and the attainment of deliverance is not dependent upon striving. 1. Nibbana is non-conditioned, asankata, non-created, non-caused, non-made, akata. And what is non-composed is not decomposable, is permanent, thuva, and indestructible, akhara. Like darkness cannot be made, but the light which prevents darkness can be extinguished, so Nibbana cannot be made, but the passions which prevent it can be eradicated. The three roots of all evil inclinations are greed, labha, hate, dosa, and delusion, moha. Greed and hate are opposed in character, for greed is desire to get more and hate is desire to get rid of. Thus, though opposed, they are only two forms of desire. And desire is always combined with delusion. We desire for things just because we do not know them, just because we do not realize their impermanent, woeful, soulless nature. We try to grasp the void, because delusion has created a phantom, which like the rainbow finds only existence in ourselves. Trying to grasp that spectre, the rainbow, the horizon, must bring about disillusion. Because they have no real existence, but change with the position of the onlooker. To realize this, is to give up craving for them, by which all suffering also will come to an end. And that is Nibbana. In the depth of our hearts we feel that bliss finally depends upon rest, upon changelessness. Even the tendency of the senses to attachment is nothing but the longing after rest in the midst of restlessness. Thus even craving is but an attempt to come to this natural equilibrium. That craving does not succeed in reaching the goal is again due to ignorance. What good can be expected from a thought that was born from a misconception? If the goal is misunderstood, no striving can correct that initial mistake. On the contrary, the greater effort employed, the greater also the distance separating in the end. If peace is sought for, this cannot be obtained by waging war. The only war that can put a stop to all war is the war against self. A war fought against others is a war of selfishness and can never lead to true peace. Like war and peace receive a different meaning dependent on the standpoint of the observer. So life and no more becoming obtain their respective values dependent on the point from which they are surveyed. From the worldling's standpoint, which is one of craving, life is real, because life is craving. And then from that same standpoint no more becoming is seen as unreal, empty, annihilation. But from a viewpoint beyond the world, Lokuttara, from where the world is viewed as impermanent, sorrow-fraught, and soulless. Any craving is seen as a vain attempt, and life itself, which is but craving, is seen as empty and unreal. while no more becoming is considered as perfect deliverance and highest bliss. Thus, though the attainment of Nibbana can rightly be said to be the absolute content for craving or desire under any form has become impossible, yet it cannot be hankered after, a panahita. But when all the fetters have been removed, fetters which arose and were maintained in ignorance, fetters which will disappear with ignorance, then that which cannot be hankered after can be realized. Hard is the infinite to see, truth is no easy thing to see, craving is pierced by him who knows, for him who sees nothing remains. Udana 8.2. But is Nibbana then total annihilation? Even this question is put in ignorance, for there is nothing to be annihilated. Only that which is, can be destroyed. But that which constantly arises, and in arising is nothing but a process of change, and in changing also constantly ceases, that cannot be said to be destroyed. It merely does not arise again. Now it should be well understood, that like arising in a process, similarly cessation is a process. So that even when the process of arising does not occur again, the process of cessation might not have come to stop yet. Hence we obtain a double aspect of Nibbana. The first one, the coming to a stop of the process of arising, is called Sayupadissa Nibbana, i.e. Nibbana with the remnant of the aggregates of craving. Life being conditioned by craving, the aggregates of life, viz. Body and mind, are rightly called the aggregates of craving. As soon as the process of the arising of craving has come to a stop, the grasping of the aggregates that form an individual will cease also. When the lust for life has ceased, no rebirth will take place further, and the highest state that of an araha is attained. But when the lust for life has ceased, life itself will not simultaneously disappear. As the heat in an oven, which is produced by fire, will remain for some time even though that the fire be extinct. So the result of craving which produced rebirth might remain for some time, even though the fire of the passions be extinct. Thus the acts of thought of an araha are neither moral nor immoral. His apperception is ineffective. Though he acts, his actions are not impelled by craving, and hence they do not constitute kama, either good or bad. They consist merely in the function, kriya javana, and are free from tendencies, likes or dislikes, anasya. But where there arises no new kama, there no further vipaka can come about. When, therefore, the result of previous kama is exhausted, even the remnant of the aggregates of clinging will be broken up, and this is called Anupadissa Nibbana or Parinibbana. While Nibbana is single in its nature, yet for the purpose of logical treatment it is thus considered as twofold. By using the two kinds of this logical distinction indiscriminately, endless confusion is caused. When thus Nibbana if said to be a mental state, this applies only to the state of an araha who has overcome all the mental defilements, kilsa, and has broken all the fetters, samyojana, which bind to rebirth. Like freedom is only a negative concept, being the absence of restrictions. Thus the freedom, moksha, of Nibbana can only be explained as the absence of defilements and mental fetters. But as those defilements are exactly the roots of all evil, the cause of all suffering, Nibbana can be called the deliverance from sorrow. Where Nibbana cannot be aimed at as a positive goal, for not by striving can world's end be reached, Gamanina na patabo locus antikyudakanam, and 4. Striving becomes possible in the overcoming of the hindrances and obstacles. Thus Nibbana remains unconditioned, asankata, and uncreated, akata. Not to be produced by cumulative virtue, not by purification of a soul, or by cleansing of a soul, or by cleansing of self. There is no ego to be made free from selfishness in order to obtain purity, but there is an ego to be got rid of, an ego misconceived by ignorance and born of craving. When that ego is understood as a delusion, the first fetter, sakyadithi, is broken and the stream which leads to Nibbana is entered, sotapatti. Like, while plunging into the water of a river, the land and the attractions thereof must be left behind. So when entering the stream of holiness, together with the delusion of self will also disappear all doubts and attachment to ritualistic performances. But in the stream itself further hindrances might occur, and they too have to be overcome. Antipathy, vyapada, and sense pleasures, kamakanda, might retard the progress of the stream winner, still causing rebirth, though not in woeful states. Only when even the last 5 obstacles will have been passed, which are desire for rebirth in form, or formless spheres, ruparaga, aruparaga, conceit, mana, which is the final and most subtle stronghold of the dying self, agitation, adaka, and ignorance, avijja. The stream will lose itself in the ocean and the freedom of Nibbana be attained. As the stream is still hemmed in on both sides by the river banks, so the path to Nibbana is beset with difficulties. But it is exactly in the overcoming of those difficulties that the freedom of Nibbana can be realized. Once more, Nibbana cannot be aimed at, desired or longed for, just because it is non-conditioned and does not arise dependent on conditions. But one can strive for the extinction of craving, for the abolition of the slavery of an imaginary self, for the overcoming of ignorance. The factors to this enlightenment, Sati Sambhajayahanga, include the perseverance of mindfulness, sati, the open-mindedness of investigation, dhammavicaya, with the steadiness of abiding energy, virya, the enthusiasm of spiritual joy, piti, together with the sobriety of tranquility of mind, pasadhi, the peacefulness of concentration, samadhi, with the harmony of equanimity, upekkha. Renunciation, not as mortification, but as a natural result of insight through which craving and clinging become impossible, is the way by which deliverance from the passions can be attained. Like a lamp must give up its oil so that its light may shine, similarly renunciation is an indispensable factor to enlightenment. Renunciation not only of the world but also of the self, like the wind the leaves from a tree, their agatha too. It is only in perfect renunciation that perfect freedom can be found. It is the will to live which leads to rebirth. It is thus the will to live that must be conquered, so that Nibbana may be attained. This lust for life cannot be cut short by violence. An act of violence against oneself may be caused by disgust with life, yet it remains lust for better life. The will to live cannot be conquered by will for no more life, but by understanding that there is no self to live. The delusion of the craving for existence can be expelled by the realization of non-self. Then not only the will be dissolved, but even the possibility of willing. When thus the insight of non-self, anatta, will have taken the place of delusion, moha, and ignorance, avijja. When being will be viewed as a mere process of becoming, and becoming as ceasing, then the spell which kept us bound so long will be broken. The dream state of hallucination will vanish and reality will be realized. This reality is not the eternalization of a self or soul, but the escape therefrom. Therefore Nibbana is not a deliverance of the self, not a salvation of the soul, but the deliverance from the self, the salvation from the soul, i.e. from the misconceived I. Once this deliverance is attained, no more hallucination can occur, because the source which produced this misconception, namely, craving, selfishness, is dried up. And with this the last word has been said, for, where craving has ceased, the process of becoming, which is grasping, has ceased also. Where there is no more becoming, there is no more rebirth and all its consequences of sorrow, decay, and death, and thus Nibbana is the only deliverance. The only freedom, surpassing all understanding, above all emotion, beyond all striving, unconditioned, uncreated, indestructible. Whereto all may attain through the overcoming of greed, hate and delusion, through insight and realization in the deliverance from self. In soundless depth of breathless thought, a silent music plays, while all the universe around, in never-ending waves, unknowingly, unwillingly, for that same silence craves, all men and beasts and things alike, for independence strive, for freedom from all wants and needs, which cause their restless drive. Thus every deed contains the seed, through which all will arrive, at even balanced, cravingless, birthless and deathless life. Notes. Striving, in the sense of the fourfold right effort, guided by insight and not desire, is however an indispensable part of the Noble Eightfold Path. See also Bodhi leaves no B28 Escapism and Escape. Editor, The wheel.